Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. As COVID-19 negatively impacts all aspects of the well-being and development of children, today our speakers will focus on one aspect that is often overlooked, the impact on emotions and spirituality. Silvia Mazzarelli and Maria Lucia Uribe of Arigatou International will discuss the emotional and spiritual impact of COVID-19 on children, the positive role of faith and spiritual nourishment in children's lives as a source of resilience and protection, the role of religious leaders and communities, examples of what faith communities are doing to protect children, and resources and strategies to nurture children's socio-emotional and spiritual well-being during this pandemic. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter any questions or comments you have for the presenters in the questions box throughout the presentation. They will answer questions at the end as time permits. One moment, please. Okay. Silvia Mazzarelli leads the work of Arigatou International in Latin America and the Caribbean as coordinator for the Global Network of Religions for Children. She has more than 13 years of experience in the region in rights-based and gender transformative development programming and influencing with a focus on child rights. Previously, she was the head of child rights policy and programming at Plan International's regional office for the Americas and collaborated with many other NGOs and international organizations in the region. Maria Lucia Uribe has been the executive director of Arigatou International in Geneva since 2013. She leads the Ethics Education for Children initiative, ensuring that values-based education is integrated into programs to respond to the prevention of violence and the promotion of peace building and interfaith and intercultural collaboration. She is the convener of the International Consortium on Nurturing Values and Spirituality in Early Childhood for the Prevention of Violence, and is also the convener of the Working Group on Children and Violence of Child Rights Connect. Silvia and Maria Lucia, we thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing this valuable information. Now I will turn it over to Silvia. One moment.
Okay, thank you, Heather. I hope you hear me all well. Can you hear me, Heather? Just checking the audio.
Yes.
And can you see my presentation?
Yes. If you could put it in full screen mode, that would be great.
Yes, sure. Okay,
Great,
here we
thank
go.
you.
So I will switch on my webcam just for a minute so that you can see who is speaking to you all, and then I'll switch it off again immediately after. So here am I. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all virtually. I'm connected from Panama City, from my home, and I hope I will not have background noise, children crying or things like that. Okay, so we're ready to start. So I'll switch off my camera and go back to the presentation. Here we are. Just let me start by saying that it's an honor for Arigatou International to partner with ISCAN for this webinar that focuses on faith and spiritual nourishment as key factors for the protection and resilience of children. The COVID-19 crisis is having a profound direct and indirect effect on all aspects of the development and well-being of children. The UN policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on children, which was recently released, and I'm sure most of you have seen it, grouped the effects of COVID-19 on children into 4. And you see them here on the slide. The first one is falling into poverty. So the effects on the family economy mainly. The second has to do with learning. So the effects on learning, as we know, most schools around the world are closed in most countries. So the impact on learning and on acquiring the essential life skills that support a healthy transition of children to adulthood is definitely important. Third, the effects on the safety and protection of children. with the increase in violence, unfortunately, by parents, caregivers, and we all know that there is also an increased risk of exposure to online violence. And fourth, the effects on spiritual and on survival and health, including mental health, meaning the comprehensive well-being and optimal development of a child in the emotional, behavioral, social, and cognitive domains. These four groups of effects, of course, are all connected. But today, I would like to add a fifth effect, which is deeply connected to these four that I just mentioned, but cannot be really boxed into any of them. And this is the effect of COVID-19 on the spiritual development of children. Before talking about how COVID-19 is affecting the spiritual development of children, allow me to share just a few thoughts on spirituality and spiritual development in children, and why at Arigatou International we focus so much on it. As a rights-based organization, we consider all children as rights holders, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as our framework. So when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we look at how the pandemic is limiting the full exercise of children's human rights and/or is violating them, or some of them. Now, Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child recognizes the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. So the spiritual development of the child is a key element of the comprehensive development of the child. It overlaps with other levels, the emotional level, the physical, the moral, the social development of the child. So it's not something separate, it overlaps. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, however, does not define what spiritual development is and leaves it to parents and caregivers with the responsibility to provide the means and life conditions for this comprehensive development to happen. But what do we mean by children's spiritual development? The root of the word spirituality is spirit, which comes from the Latin spiritus, which means soul, breath of life, and is related to the word spirare, which means to breathe. Now, there are many definitions of spirituality, and it's not possible to get to one definition. However, today I would like to offer the definition, one definition that I particularly like, which is that of Dr. Krystyna Puchalski, which is the founder of the Institute for Spirituality and Health of the University George Washington. She understands spirituality as the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. When we look at the spiritual development of a child, we typically highlight 6 elements that you can see in this slide. Let me quickly go through each of them. So let's start with the first. Spiritual development is embedded with the notion of child. Children are spiritual beings. Spirituality is an essential human characteristic, which is at the core of human existence and is reflected in all aspects of human existence. It is intrinsic in every human being. It is deeply interconnected with other human dimensions like the physical dimension, emotional, social, and intellectual dimensions. Second, spiritual development is a process. So we have to look at spiritual development as a process and not spirituality as a thing in itself. If children are spiritual beings, any intention to nurture their spirituality needs to start at very early ages and needs to consider the development capacities and the development stages of the child. Now, we know from research that the first 2 years are extremely important for the comprehensive development of a child, but also the following 6 years. So it's actually until age 8, which is what is considered early childhood. And in fact, it is during this period when children, as you see in the image, learn to speak and to process information. So it's the cognitive development. They learn how to walk, so the physical development. They learn to develop skills such as sharing, resolving conflict without violence, regulating their own emotions, so the emotional development. They learn about everything that happens around them. They start exploring the world, so the social development. But it is also in this period of time that they start developing their identity and experiencing their connectedness to themselves, to others, to natures, as well as a sense of belonging to their family, to their community. So they become in touch with their inner capacity to imagine, to wonder, to empathize with others. And all of this has to do with the spiritual development. Third, search. Human beings are in constant search for the meaning and purpose of life. It is in early childhood that children start asking about who they are, about where they come from, their family, and they start asking themselves existential questions about life and death. They also start discovering how their actions can influence others. And this brings me to the element of the relationships, which is the fourth element I want to highlight here. The spiritual development of children is closely related to their ethical development, understood as their capacity to positively relate to themselves and others from a perspective of an ethics of care that conceives caring for the other human being as if we held the life of the other in our hands. There is a word in Zulu language, which is Ubuntu, and this means I am because you are. So it perfectly talks about the interconnectedness of life and how this relates to spirituality, this connection and relation with the self, with others, with nature, and with what we can call God, divine, transcendent. So this connection and relation is also very important, and it's within this element of relationships. Fifth, environments. Now, science tells us that while our genes that are passed on to us by our biological parents establish the broad basis of human development, the environment where children grow up in, so the family, the community, the school, helps form who they grow to be. So the genes and environment together shape the quality of brain architecture and establish either a robust or a fragile foundation for all of the learning, the physical, the social, emotional, health, and behavior that follows, as well as create the foundations for their spiritual well-being. And finally, the sixth element is that spirituality and spiritual development is not just within religion. And this means that a person can be spiritual even though not identified with a religion. So in summary, and you see it in the yellow box on the slide, spiritual development helps children to be grounded and understand their roots, builds a sense of belonging, strengthens their identity and positive relations with others, as well as lifts them up to develop a sense of purpose and meaning to who they are, what they do, where they live, what they are meant to be and want to become, and how they want to contribute to society. So being grounded, being lifted up and uplifting, this search for purpose and the connection with others and the contribution to society. Now, I want to add just one more important consideration, that is, if children are spiritual beings and can connect easily to their spiritual dimension, and all of you that have children know that sometimes they can connect even better than us adults, we should listen more to them and learn from them. And at the same time, this should lead us to seeing them as agents of their own spiritual development, which puts us in a different role, which is a role of facilitators and not a role of teachers, so to say. So this brings me to the concept of spiritual nurture, which is about enabling children to pursue their own spiritual development. And my colleague, Maria Lucia, will develop this much more in depth in her presentation that will focus on how to nurture spirituality in children in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So spirituality and spiritual development is a key element of the comprehensive development of a child. Now, I said that one characteristic of spirituality and spiritual development is that it is not just within religion, and this is very true. However, I would like now to make another point, and it's the point that faith leaders and communities can greatly contribute to the comprehensive development of children, and particularly in this spiritual dimension. In fact, among the common principles that link the Convention on the Rights of the Child with religious teaching are, for example, a holistic notion of the child and a comprehensive understanding of the child's physical, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. Last year, Arigatou International developed a study called Faith and Children's Rights, a multi-religious study on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This study explores the links between the core values of 7 religions and the standards and principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then I invite you all to have a look at this study to explore more on this topic. The study is available on Arigatou International's website. Now, faith plays a significant role in the lives of most of the world's population throughout the entire life course of a person, from when they are born or even before, to when they die or even beyond. Now, according to the Pew Research Center, in 2012, 5.8 billion people identified with a religious group, and that represented 84% of the 2010 world population, which was at that time of 6.9 billion. Now, in Latin America, which is a region where I have been living and working for the past 13 years, approximately 79% of the population considers itself Christian, 4% of other religions, and only 17% atheist, agnostic, or with no religion. And these are statistics of Latino Barometro from 2018. So it is also important to mention that most people around the world actually turn to religious guidance and support in times of acute need and crisis, especially in certain parts of the world, for example, the region where I work and live. One of the key findings from a scoping study commissioned in 2018 by the Ending Violence Against Children Hub of the Joint Learning Initiative for Local Faith Communities, the JLI, I'm trying to go to the next slide, here I am, is that usually faith leaders are recognized as community gatekeepers with access capital and social capital in bringing resources to the table. However, less acknowledged is the importance of harnessing faith spiritual capital. For, in particular, this study focused on the task of protecting children from all forms of violence. And you can read on the slide what we mean by access capital, social capital, and spiritual capital. Now, for this to happen, it is important, of course, that religious communities go beyond dogmatisms and commit themselves to promote and nurture values and spiritualities in their communities. So now that we've talked about the importance of the spiritual development of a child for the comprehensive development of the child, let's talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on this particular dimension, the spiritual dimension. In humanitarian contexts, during emergencies or in situations of great adversities or high levels of violence, we must take into account all aspects of the well-being of children, not only, as I said many times, not only the physical and emotional well-being, but also their spiritual safety and well-being. But how is COVID-19 impacting on the spiritual well-being of children? Here on this slide, there are just some of the effects. For example, children are facing fear and anxiety about self-isolation and physical social distancing, and about the negative impact of the pandemic on their lives and communities. Their psychological and emotional stability is affected by the increasing uncertainty regarding their future. In some cases, this can even result in depressive disorders that can, as we all know, have a lifelong effect on them and prevent them from developing fully and reaching their full potential. Now, the confinement measures and lockdowns, and we are all, or most of us are in lockdown right now, have broken their connections with others. Schools are closed in almost all the countries of the world, so they cannot spend time with their friends as they did before. They are forced home, and we all know that for some children, home means more violence, more abuse, and more neglect. Children are asking themselves existential questions about life, about themselves, about the world. They ask themselves, why is this happening? Why is it happening to me? Why is it happening to my grandma? Why is it happening to my family? Why is God allowing this to happen? And when the responses they receive fail to address their questions, it breaks their sense of trust and respect for other human beings, which, as we have seen, are key elements for their spiritual well-being. So the spiritual impact is there, and it needs to be taken into account and addressed. However, we can also look at this from another angle or perspective, because spiritual nourishment in children can be an important source of resilience and protection, especially in the context of adverse situations like the one we are living in now. Now, for people of faith, and as we saw, a high percentage of the worldwide population identifies with a faith, a religion, we could say faith and spiritual nourishment can be important sources of resilience and protection for children, especially in the context of adverse situations like the one we are experiencing right now. And why is that? Because faith and spirituality have the potential to give an answer to these deep existential needs and questions. Faith and spirituality can help children to make sense of the suffering. They can help children to cope with the uncertainties associated with the adverse situations and difficulties that they are experiencing. They can facilitate the healing and the rebuilding of the connections and the trust that they have lost. They can help them to recognize and reinforce their strengths as survivors. And they can help them accept and give a new meaning to their traumatic experiences instead of denying these experiences or suppressing these experiences. Now, academic researchers have studied the relationship between spirituality and resilience across various disciplines. For example, around people that experience death, violent trauma, war, austerity, and chronic disease. The figure in this slide summarizes the relationship between spirituality and resilience based on existing research. And this figure is from a very interesting piece of research of my dear friend Maria Alejandra Andrade on the role of spirituality in building up the resilience of migrant children in Central America. Now, although most studies don't focus specifically on children, there are some interesting ones that do look at the relationship between spirituality and resilience in children. For example, among displaced population, and the importance of nurturing spirituality, for example, in migrant children, both in multi-faith and non-faith settings. There's also some research that points to religiosity and spirituality as protective factors for youth-related violence. Now, in the region where I work, in the Latin American Caribbean region, studies have shown that spiritual development and nurturing in children can be a protective factor and can strengthen resilience in situations of adversity or risk, including situations of violence. Children with a higher level of spiritual maturity and practice are better able to cope with stressful situations caused by inequality, social marginalization, poverty, and these are all causes and consequences at the same time of violence in the region where I work and live. Research shows that religion, religiosity, and spirituality are a source of strength and hope, are associated with greater satisfaction with life and spiritual well-being, and serve as emotional and social support. They promote pro-social values, they contribute to better physical and psychological health, reduces depression, anxiety, stress, among others. There's an interesting study in El Salvador, for example, that suggested that religious coping and spirituality are indirectly protective for gang violence among high-risk youth, because elevated levels of religious coping and spirituality are associated with less antisocial bonding, and this in turn is associated with lower levels of violent behavior among these Salvadoran youth. So the understanding of these relationships between faith, spirituality, and resilience in children is of great relevance to public health and the overall well-being of children and young people within and across regions. Now, there's one last point I want to make before giving the floor to my colleague Maria Lucia, that will explain how children's spirituality can be nurtured in religious contexts, but also through ordinary day-to-day activities. The last point I want to make is that the response approach to this pandemic must be interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder. I started my intervention by saying that the pandemic is negatively impacting all aspects of the well-being and development of children, including one aspect that is often overlooked, which is the spiritual aspect. And spiritual nurture and care is an interdisciplinary matter. Governments alone cannot provide an adequate and meaningful response to the impact of the pandemic on children and families, and current responses fail to address some crucial dimensions of this comprehensive well-being of children, which is a comprehensive well-being of children that includes the spiritual well-being. So we at Arigatou International strongly believe it is extremely important to acknowledge the contributions of different stakeholders, of all stakeholders, including the unique contributions of religion, religious faith actors, bring everyone to the table, and of course, work more together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Now I will turn it over to Maria Lucia.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I will also quickly show myself. So my name is Maria Lucia Uribe, and I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland, working for Arigatou. But I live in France across the border, so I'm also at home now in France. And so thank you, Heather, for the introduction. I'm going to turn off my camera. Thank you, Heather, for the introduction. Thank you, Sylvia, for this great introduction to the topic. And I'm very glad to be here with all of you and to share about the work that we at Arigatou International have been doing to protect and support children during the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly on the topic of nurturing values and spirituality in children. So I have structured my presentation in 3 areas. One, what is critical about the impact of COVID-19 on children's well-being, building on what Sylvia has said and has reflected on. Second, how Arigatou International is responding to support children's spiritual well-being, and I will present concrete tools and material that have been developed. And 3, and I think the time will not give me for a lot, so maybe just one example of faith-based organizations and religious communities working to protect children. So Sylvia presented the importance of the spiritual development. Hello?
Excuse me, Maria. Sorry about that. It says that we're waiting to see your screen. Have you chosen to share your screen?
Yes.
Okay. Perhaps there's just a delay.
Before.
Okay.
Now?
There, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I haven't moved the slides, so that's good. So Sylvia presented the importance of the spiritual development of children and how this has been impacted during the COVID-19. Building on this, I would like to highlight 3 critical points on the impact of COVID-19 to understand the need to address children's spiritual well-being during this period, and that can help frame the type of response in this area. So first is the impact on human rights and freedoms. The world as we know it today is changing. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to limit our physical contact with others, has restricted many fundamental freedoms, like freedom of expression in certain countries, freedom of movement, and affected the fulfillment of many rights, particularly for the most vulnerable, including children. The right to education, for instance, the right to health, the right to work for many independent workers, the right to be protected from harm and violence, as we see the rise in domestic violence, just to name a few. COVID-19 has also made more evident the social inequalities in our world, as the most vulnerable get more negatively impacted. Today, more than ever, we realize the importance of our interconnectedness as we face the rupture of a world that has privileged individualism and economic growth, and start seeing the need for social safety nets for the most vulnerable. This is the changing world we are seeing today and that our children are being exposed to as they experience higher levels of stress, anxiety, and uncertainty about the future from their parents and caregivers, but also by themselves, as Sylvia pointed out. We are now raising children in constrained environments filled with fear, and even if measures are loosened up in the near future, it is foreseen that for some time, social distancing practices will need to continue. In a recent study on the impact of COVID-19 on children conducted by World Vision International with 101 children, 71% of the children expressed that they felt isolated and lonely due to school closures, and 91% of respondents acknowledged that they were facing emotional distress and troubling feelings, including anxiety, anger, and worry due to the uncertainty of how long this crisis will last and dealing with isolation. So how do we support then children's spiritual well-being in this changing world when children's spaces that further their full development are affected? The second critical point is the rise in xenophobia. Related to the previous point, I want to highlight how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated xenophobia, hate, and exclusion, as mentioned by the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues in recent interventions. This includes physical attacks against Chinese and other Asians, hate speech blaming Roma and Hispanics for the spread of the virus, and calls by some political leaders for migrants to be denied access to medical services. In some countries, we are seeing a rise in Islamophobia. Anti-Semitic hate speech has risen alarmingly, and across social media, we are also seeing a rise in hate speech against minority groups. Children and young people have now more access to the internet with more time spent on their own and without proper spaces within the school or family settings to discuss and critically think of the veracity of the information that they get access to. This continued display of discriminatory rhetoric affects children and young people's view of the world, their relations with others, and create negative narratives about the other that might become normalized in societies as nationalistic groups gain more space and exacerbate their ideologies against minorities. So how do we support children's well-being when their identities, sense of belonging, and connection with others are being affected? And Sylvia spoke about that as part of the spiritual nurturing of the child. The third critical point is the impact of COVID on poverty, domestic violence, and the environment. The World Bank estimates that suggests that COVID-19 will push 49 million people into extreme poverty in 2020. We know that poverty exacerbates violence against children as it deprives them from basic services, access to education, and impacts family well-being. The interdependence between human actions against the environment and the exposure to novel viruses like the coronavirus 19 has now become more evident than before, placing greater importance to the need to protect Mother Earth and develop more sustainable practices in our behaviors. Children's future and spiritual well-being is compromised when we fail to address the environmental crisis today, and that we negatively affect the possibility for children to connect with nature. Sylvia has shared about the rise in domestic violence that is being reported worldwide, with an increase in violence against children exacerbated by the stress at home. An often ignored fact is how poverty can affect children's agency and capacity and opportunities to participate in society and in decisions that affect them. Children's empowerment is closely related to their spiritual development, as children are equipped to positively respond to the ethical challenges in their societies and see themselves not as isolated human beings, but as agents of change, able to influence the world around them. We have all students of the world currently out of the classroom without access to a computer, and more than 40% of children with no internet access at home, with increasing disparities in access to education and learning, compromising children's capacity to develop their agency fully. So what kind of responses are needed to support children's spiritual well-being in a world affected by the COVID-19 pandemic that faces disruption, first in our social fabric, in protection of fundamental freedoms, in increasing levels of poverty and domestic violence, that challenges practices that attempt against our environment, and that lacks global leadership to respond with a common approach to a problem that affects us all. So how are children and people being prepared to respond and help co-create and transform a world that needs healing? So based on these critical reflections, Arigatou International has developed a campaign titled Faith in Action for Children to protect, support, and empower children during the COVID-19 pandemic. So many of you might not know what Arigatou International does. So Arigatou International is a non-profit organization created in Japan that works to bring people of different religious and cultural backgrounds together to build a world better for children, while promoting multi-stakeholder initiatives that ensure that all children are treated with dignity, all children's rights are respected, and all children have the opportunity to freely pursue their full potential. So Arigatou International developed this campaign, Faith in Action for Children, that is focused on 3 axes. First is mobilizing religious communities and child protection experts to protect children from violence and support their spiritual well-being. Second, promoting approaches for parents, caregivers, and teachers to foster children's spiritual safety and well-being during and after the lockdown, and raising the voices of children and young people to foster ethical reflections on the impact of COVID-19 in their lives and empower them to contribute to the transformation of our world. So all these 3 axes are very much based on the elements I mentioned before, on the need to empower children. The world is changing, so how children will respond to this. So how children face a world that is seeing increased xenophobia, how children face the world where their rights are being diminished and violated, and how children face a world where there is more violence and where many of them have been in lockdown, facing all kinds of hardships and problems to their own well-being. So the whole campaign is based on this ethical demand in a way that we see. So I want to share with you concrete ways that we see concrete ways that we have been working on, materials that we have created. And so the first one, so here, in this slide, you can see several of the materials that we have developed. We have developed activities for families to develop activities with children ages 4 to 18, messages for communities on how to respond to support children's well-being, and concrete actions for religious leaders and communities. So I'm going to walk you through some of these things, and I'm going to go a little bit more concrete on examples on how we can nurture the spirituality of children. I saw in some of the questions also some people asking, how do you do this at home? Families are the first responders, so how can they do it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the first one is an adaptation of a program that Arigatou International has that is called Learning to Live Together. It's an ethics education program for intercultural interfaith learning. So we have, and this is developed in 13 languages, this program. It has been implemented in more than 40 countries around the world. And it's been implemented in formal and non-formal education. So what we did was to adapt the activities of this manual for families to work with children and young people. So I'm going to show you a little bit. You can download this manual for free on our website. There are 32 activities proposed to help children reflect about the current situation, their relations with others, about themselves, injustices, their rights, as well as focus on creating spaces for family members to connect with one another. And I think this is critical when Sylvia spoke about the importance of the environment of the child, how, nurturing the spirituality of the child is not an isolated thing we do. It has to be comprised by several elements, and the environment where the spirituality of the child is nurtured is critical for this to happen. And so I'm going to show you some of the activities that have been developed. And so, for example, the use of puppets. So how, at home when you have small children, this is an activity for children age 4 to 11. I do it very often with my child who is 4 years old. And through puppets, you can help children express their feelings. You can share about situations. I have explained, for example, about the coronavirus to my child through, toys moving and talking to each other, and she asks questions. We talk about injustices in the world. We talk about problems that happen to other people. And it's a very good way for the children to express their feelings, to propose solutions, and to think of what's going on in a non-threatening way. So that's very helpful, because you don't put the child on the spot, or, what do you think about this, or why, why do you think that the kids cannot go out? But you put a situation where, for example, if you're talking about the COVID-19, children talk about the situation and children feel sad. So your child is not expressing the feeling directly, it's expressing through others, and that opens up for the child to express himself or herself and to make sense of what's going on. So this is one of the activities we have. Also, writing letters to neighbors or family members. Connecting with others, expressing solidarity and caring for one another is an important aspect of nurturing children's spirituality. When we are in lockdown, it's difficult to have contact with other people. So how we create these opportunities for children to still connect with one another, care for one another when they don't have access to that other. And so this is one of the activities that they can write letters, put them in the mailbox. They can write letters to family members in other countries, maybe take a picture and send it, or send it later on, or go to the post office and send it. Creating the space for children to think about the close family, their friends, the people around them, those who are suffering, is an important component to nurture their spirituality, because you nurture their care for others. So we are in isolation, we are alone, but there is this other out there. So that's another activity. We have another one called My Life Tree. Here children can connect with oneself. They think about things that matters to them. There is an adaptation to this for smaller children. This is for 12 to 15. And very often at this age with teenagers, there is a disconnect sometimes with parents and young people. At the teenage years, the teenagers start disconnecting a little bit with their parents, and parents at times don't know what are their likes, or what are their dislikes. So it's a good activity to connect with children, to make them think about who they are, their roots, what is happening, their families, who is important in their lives, and to value these small things in life. So it's a great activity, simple activities. All these activities can be done at home with paper. You don't need many materials to work on them. There is this another one, your silhouette is mine. And so empathizing with the other, as I mentioned, is critical to develop also this children's spirituality. So empathizing with another member of the family. This is an activity where you have paper and you make the silhouette of the other, and you can do it, parent and child, or siblings, for them to think of how the other is feeling, what the other needs, what the other has in his head, what he's thinking, what the other wants to do. And I think when we're in this confinement, and I think all of you would agree with me, that we feel uneasy with ourselves at times. It's not easy to be, and if you have big families, small apartments and small houses, this becomes difficult. And how do we express that? How we create this space in the family to create this connection with one another? I'm running out of time, I'm going quickly. There are more activities here, and activities to take responsibility for home improvements, or working with the family on this. We have also developed these two posters, which are, we believe that there are families who don't have access to computers, there are no computers at home, or families that don't have time to go through this booklet. So these are simple messages of things that can be done in the family setting. And so you see some of the points raised here. So simple things that families can do: nurture spaces for gratitude at home, creating time to do things together, playing, reading stories, cooking, gardening, eating, helping children connect via phone or the internet with family and friends, find joy and positivity in the little things in life, create spaces for meditation, reflection, and praying together, find ways to do something for the community, help someone in need, talk and share about feelings, talk about the virus, be a role model. And this be a role model, I think, is critical on the spiritual development children, their ethical reflections, and how we as parents, as caregivers, can become also vulnerable. And we don't, the situation is hard in all of us. So how we can also show that vulnerability to our children, still being there and strong for them, but also for them to understand that this is happening to all of us, and that we are vulnerable as well. So that's also part of this connection, this interconnecting with one another. And the second element of the campaign, so this is on the adaptation of the activities. We have another component in in the campaign, which is the empowerment of children. So you will see on our website that we have the voices of children, and we have been collecting the voices of children around the world. So a very important way to protect children is to empower them. Very often we think that the protection of children is a vertical action that we do towards children, but we forget that children are individuals in their own right, and that their empowerment is a sine qua non for their protection as they become aware of their rights and get equipped to speak up and respond in positive ways. So an empowered children is a child that can think critically, a child that can speak up his views, a child that is aware of the social reality and understands the consequences of those actions, a child that practices empathy and solidarity with others and is aware of this interconnectedness of life, is equipped to respond, and is a child whose spirituality is nurtured and affirmed. So you will see on the website, yesterday we conducted an interfaith prayer with children. And this was a very spiritual moment for all of us. We have the voices of children praying with us, giving their reflections, and with religious leaders from 7 different religions. And it was a moment for them to express also their views, to have their voices being heard. And we think that there is a lot of emphasis today on, doing things for children, but there is not a lot of emphasis on how their voices are heard, how they feel. So that was an important activity yesterday. Going a little bit faster, and the third component is mobilizing religious communities and child protection experts. So we have developed this booklet that you see it on the screen. They have 9 concrete actions and recommendations for religious leaders and communities to nurture values and spirituality in children, to protect children from violence, to explain to their communities about the impact of COVID-19, to help create healthy, nurturing, and safe environments, to strengthen faith in the community, and empower children to participate. And I think religious communities can help a lot with that, creating spaces for children to connect, to participate in the online services, to maybe write and express their views, so they are also shared with the members of the community. So the religious leaders also have an important role to play in advocating to the local and national governments. So as Sylvia said, there is an ecosystem of the child. So the spirituality of the child is not nurtured in a vacuum. It needs to be nurtured with the environment, with the parents, with the religious communities, with the laws and policies that are in place. So it's important that religious leaders talk about the impact of COVID-19 on violence against children, the impact on their lives, on their well-being, and advocate for investment on children, for not forgetting what is happening inside homes with domestic violence, and to respond to their needs. So because I want to have time for questions, I'm not going to talk more. There are several examples. This is just one from Shanti Ashram in Coimbatore, India, where there is a faith-based organization that is working with several religious communities, promoting collaboration and action for the most vulnerable, doing competitions for children to express their views through storytelling, photography, singing, so nurturing this inner self of the child so they don't feel isolated at home, and creating awareness about social distancing, educating people about hygiene, but also providing financial support to the most vulnerable. So there is a comprehensive approach to ensure that families create the right environment for children to nurture their spirituality. I will leave it here to open it for questions. And then feel free to write to me for questions. You can download our materials on the website. I forgot to put the website here, arigatouinternational.org. So you can download all the materials. So thank you so much. Heather, I give it back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria Lucia, and to Sylvia for sharing this really important and interesting information with us today. Let me change my screen here real quick. Okay, thank you. Yes, we have lots of great questions coming in. There are several questions about the materials, so I'm just going to ask those first. As you just mentioned, all of the activities and materials you just spoke about are available on the Arigatou website. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. It's www.arigatouinternational.org. And you go to the response page, COVID-19, and you have all the materials available. They are in Spanish and English, and some are being developed in French.
Wonderful. Okay, so a few questions about the resources. One person is asking if the materials or programs have been tested for use specifically with children who've experienced abuse and neglect, and if there's been any data on the materials or programs in terms of their effectiveness for parents or even therapists to use.
Yeah, so we have, as I mentioned, we have this program called Learning to Live Together. So this material has been adapted for this program that has been developed for more than 10 years. It has been implemented in more than 40 countries. We have done monitoring and evaluation. It has been used in context of children of victims of violence, for example, in Latin America, with children that are victims of violence, domestic violence, but also gun violence, for example, in Greece with refugee settings, in Kenya, in children affected by conflicts between different tribal groups. So it's in a variety of settings, very much in very delicate situations and children that are in situations that are of vulnerability. Our evaluation have shown how children connect with one another, how children strengthen their connection with oneself, how children become more aware of the situation with others, how children build closer relations with others, how children, in terms of the spirituality, we have concrete questions when we did the evaluation of this. So, for example, empathizing with others, how children became, part of the community. For example, children that felt exclusion in their classrooms or in the community, so how that changed throughout the period. So yes, an evaluation is available, so happy to talk more about this later.
Great, thank you. And we have some attendees wondering if these materials are adaptable or can be used with children with special needs or in families with illiteracy.
Yeah, so they can be adapted, as I mentioned. What we provide is basically a framework. The activities that we have developed now that have been adapted for the COVID-19 pandemic, they vary in terms of difficulty, if you want. So there are simple ones like how you use moments of cooking, gardening, doing things simple together. And we have developed these two posters that I show that it's more for families that don't have time maybe to read this material. So how you create awareness about how to do it with simple language. So that is developed precisely thinking about families that cannot read and that find it difficult. So we are still adapting this. We are working also with our trainers on the ground on how this can be implemented and become more accessible to families. So we welcome also ideas and suggestions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And still a lot of questions coming in about accessing these resources. So people are very interested in these. Thank you. We've had a few questions about communicating to children, how to make sense of the suffering that's happening as a result of COVID-19, and perhaps how best to communicate in a spiritual way to the youngest of children about what's happening.
Yes, Sylvia have answered. Do you want to answer some of these questions, or you want me to go ahead with this?
Go ahead. I think that's more from your side.
Yes. So how to communicate? The question, Heather, is how to communicate about COVID-19 to children?
Yes, I think especially, with the youngest of children who may not really understand what's happening, and also and the results of COVID-19, kind of the suffering and the scary things that they see as a result.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, I mentioned about using puppets, and that's an activity I use with my child who is 4 years old. And of course, it's very difficult to keep children isolated, pretending that nothing is happening. And I know that many parents prefer to do this, not to tell what is going on. But children notice this. Children can sense from our own, way of doing things and how stressed also the environments are. They cannot go to the park, they cannot see their friends. So those are questions they have. In our approach to the spiritual development of children, which is closely related to these ethical reflections, We want children to ask questions, and we want children to reflect on that. So activities like, for example, using puppets, where the puppets cannot go out, and then the child cannot go to school. So you explain why, and then there is a virus that is affecting, making people sick. So there are very simple ways to do this without overwhelming children with the consequences, but mostly what is happening and what is important that we help each other, care for one another. So with the focus more on the importance of caring for one another, so we cannot go out because we have to care to the elders, for example, don't get sick. So I see with a language that is very simple, this can be done. So there are a few examples in the booklet, and I'm happy to share more ideas through email.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you for that. Some people are asking and thinking about, kind of after COVID-19. Have you been working on or thinking about nourishing spirituality once things return a bit to normal, or the stages that are coming up?
Yes, exactly. We have been doing this for many years. So this is basically what Arigatou with the office in Geneva has been doing for more than 18 years. It's to focus on nurturing the spirituality of children and ethical values. And so we will continue doing this. But of course, how we see, and that's what I said in my presentation, the world is changing, or we are seeing an exacerbation of many issues that affect children. So there are ethical reflections that we have been going through. And so we are continuing thinking that this adaptation, the activities for the family are critical. Normally we have been doing this in schools or non-formal settings, but not necessarily with the families. So we are thinking of how we continue supporting families with all the challenges we have on families working and all this, to make it more accessible. And of course, influencing other settings, not just the family, not just the schools, but also policies and education and other settings that help nurturing the spirituality of the child.
If I may add here, Maria Lucia, I think I just want to make the point again that the spiritual development is an important part of the comprehensive development of the child. So we look at this during times of emergency, like the one we are experiencing right now, but also during the ordinary, life of a child. And I think this is important to always to keep it really there with us, because it's not just something now because of the impact of COVID-19. This is, it's a human right, really, of the child, to a standard of living that is adequate for its spiritual development, as well as the physical, mental, moral, social development. And I think that was what one of the most important points I wanted to convey through my presentation. And the other thing I want to say is that although this, as I said, the spiritual development is not a religious thing, or it's not only within the religious domain. However, faith and faith communities and faith actors can play an important role in this. So what we do at Arigatou International is make sure that all actors, all stakeholders take part in the comprehensive development of children, each of them from their perspective, each of them, from the position they are in society. And so how can we, as organizations, for example, us as Arigatou International, support faith communities in doing so, in nurturing spirituality in children? So this is also something that we do, and we are more than happy to share more information through email on how we do that and how we work with faith communities.
Yes, and to that point, are there best practices that you are seeing for religious leaders during this time when face-to-face gatherings are not possible? Or are there things religious leaders are doing that you think are very effective?
Well, we have mobilized. Yeah, go ahead, Maria Lucia.
Well, you can talk about Latin America, Sylvia. I just want to say that, yes, precisely, and you will see on the website, I just put it here on the chat, I put the link to the Arigatou International response page to COVID-19, and you can find all the resources there that I show here, and then you have the link to the ethics education for children, which is where we have the materials that are not COVID-19 related, but that have been the basis for what we have developed, particularly on ethics education. And so, yes, we see religious communities responding. We have been collecting the voices of religious leaders. So you will see also on the website several religious leaders advocating for some of these things, challenging violence against children in the family, or social norms that condone violence against children. So one of the questions saying that there are religious leaders or healers that promote violence, and so how to challenge that. And our approach is actually using the voices of those who have the narratives that challenge those views through theologies that challenge or that propose a new narrative that is positive for the bringing of children in comparison to those that might be violent. So we see several of these in Lebanon, we see in South Africa, we see in Kenya, the voices of several leaders who are advocating are very vocal through media, radio, different programs, and we are collecting those voices and those stories to start showcasing them on our website. And this is part of what we are doing, trying to evaluate how what we are promoting has an impact in the field. So we are collecting stories not just from religious communities, but from the members of our network, the Global Network Religions for Children, faith-based organizations and communities that are working directly with children in the field.
Great. And related to that, we did have a couple questions from attendees asking about cases where religious leaders are perhaps spreading misinformation or not following preventative measures during this time with COVID-19. Have you seen that, or do you have any recommendations for communities?
Yes. So actually, what a few weeks ago, or right after the OMS declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, we decided that it was really urgent to mobilize faith communities and religious leaders, to support the messages of physical distancing and the avoiding the religious gatherings, etc. Because we saw that various religious leaders continued to have their religious gatherings in churches with thousands of people, and there were a few cases in the region where I work in Chile, for example, but also in Brazil, etc., where this has actually increased the levels of the virus and the COVID-19. So that was what we said. It was urgent to mobilize them. So we quickly put together, religious leaders from different faith traditions to send, messages and support us with a social media campaign to promote those messages that we wanted to promote, and that these are the kinds of things we do. We think that it's also important to transform from within, right? So if it's faith communities and religious leaders themselves that share messages, then it's easier, to get those messages and possibly also counter other kinds of messages which are negative messages that we do not want to disseminate. So that's the kind of mobilization that we try to do, and we have tried to do with this in the framework of this pandemic.
Okay, wonderful. And maybe if one of you could just end on a positive note, are there changes that you're seeing happening in terms of religion and spirituality that are positive as a result of COVID-19 that you think can and should be carried into the future?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in our work, when we promote interfaith collaboration, I think we are seeing some responses when our partners in the field are sending us, the way they are working together or response. So reaching out to other faith communities, for example, so not doing this in isolation. And I think that's a very important message, that there is so much we are forced to be isolated alone, and most communities are just doing by themselves. But how do we work with the other and challenge this rising xenophobia and distancing with the other? And we are seeing this in several places, as I mentioned in India, how they have a statement with all religious communities in Coimbatore, in the town, where they will be working together, they are responding together, they are in communication together. And particularly in India, I think, challenging these narratives of the negative narratives of the other, these voices of religious leaders are extremely important. So we are seeing positive things on this. I think this interconnectedness with the other, that seems challenging today. I think religious leaders are taking a very bold step in connecting with the other. And I think the interfaith prayer yesterday that we conducted with children and religious leaders is also proof of the intention and the spirit of collaboration, unity, and solidarity that many religious communities are displaying, which challenges also the negative, violent narrative of religious communities being isolated or displaying, narratives that are not positive. So I think that's, for me, a very encouraging and inspiring.
And if I may, just to add to that, another to end also with another positive note, I think that we have seen an increase in the understanding and acknowledgement of the need to bring everyone to the table, and and to promote this multi-stakeholder partnerships and collaborations, which we really try to focus on a lot. I think this is very positive, and also coming from more secular sectors. The acknowledgement of the role and the unique contributions of faith communities of different sectors of society, and the importance of all together work together, to respond to this pandemic. So I think that's another positive note.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So we're a little bit over time. I just want to thank everyone in the audience for joining today and for your great questions. As Sylvia and Maria Lucia mentioned, if your question was not answered today, we have them, and we will put you in contact with the speakers to get those questions answered as best we can. So again, a big thank you to Sylvia and Maria Lucia for joining us today and sharing this valuable information. And I would like to invite all of you to visit ISPCAN's COVID-19 resources page on our website for a variety of resources for different disciplines, as well as for parents and children. At the bottom of this page, you'll also find a forum where you can continue this conversation by posting comments or questions, and also any resources or strategies you would like to share. You can also sign up for alerts when others post. And a reminder that a recording of this webinar and the slides will be available on our website within 24 hours at ispcan.org. We also encourage you to become a member of ISPCAN if you're not already, so that we can continue offering webinars like these in the future. If you're interested in presenting or have ideas for topics, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. Thank you all again for joining us today. We hope you stay safe and stay strong, and have a great day or night, depending on where you are. Thank you, Sylvia and Maria Lucia.
Thank you, Heather. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.